Before we get into this, a small confession. This is a story about freedom, yet every image you're about to see shows whale oil lamps. Producing properly lit visuals at this scale was, shall we say, beyond the production budget. Rather fitting, really, for a film about the fuel that replaced freedom. You'll just have to trust us on the glow. In 1850, America burned whale oil in millions of lamps. Every household relied on hunted creatures or wood for light. Now try to find true energy independence anywhere. You will find faint traces on exactly 0 modern grids. One source of freedom is missing from virtually every household in history. The official explanation for this absence is technological progress. That explanation stopped being true in 1859. So, what actually replaced it? Energy independence was not merely a rare luxury in the early American Republic. It was the most decentralized resource on Earth, guarded more jealously than territory by ordinary households across the nation. For 300 years, producing your own light without reliance on distant suppliers meant engaging with the most brutal industry of the age. No other fuel in history has required its own dedicated fleets of ships and the sacrifice of thousands of lives. And the story of how whale oil was made explains exactly why. The source was the sperm whale, harvested from the vast Atlantic and Pacific Oceans by American whaling fleets. The ports of New Bedford, Massachusetts, and Nantucket became the production centers, and the process was extraordinary in its brutality. Whalers set out in small open boats to chase and harpoon living whales, often in epic battles that could last for hours as the creatures thrashed and dove. Once the whale was killed, the massive carcass was secured alongside the ship. Teams of men stripped the blubber in long sheets using sharp flensing knives. The blubber was then chopped into small pieces and thrown into huge trypots suspended over fires on the deck. The rendering process lasted for days, with the crew boiling the fat until the oil separated. The smell was so foul that passing ships avoided whalers by miles, and the stench lingered in ports for weeks after a fleet returned. Each whale yielded only a few barrels of usable sperm oil after the long and laborious process. This secretion was carefully skimmed, cooled, and stored in wooden barrels. The resulting whale oil required roughly one large sperm whale to produce 40 to 60 gallons of high-quality lighting fuel. That is roughly the amount needed to keep a single household lamp burning through an entire winter. The whaling captains and contemporary historians documented the process in ship logs and published journals. Their accounts describe the precise temperatures that had to remain carefully controlled during the boiling. Too much heat turned the oil dark and smoky, ruining it for lamps. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Because of this insane production cost and the constant danger at sea, whale oil was literally valued at its weight in silver. A single gallon could cost the equivalent of several days' wages for an average laborer in the 1850s. And here is where the economics becomes something else entirely. Energy independence was not simply expensive, it was becoming unsustainable. Whale populations in the traditional hunting grounds had been devastated by decades of industrial harvesting, and the precise hunting routes, the exact rendering techniques, the exact timing of voyages were pushed to their limits. Not gradually, abruptly. American whaling ships had to venture farther into uncharted waters, with voyages extending from months to years. Crews faced storms, disease, and the ever-present risk of the whale turning the tables. The industry faced an impending collapse as supply dwindled and prices skyrocketed. For 3 centuries, the fuel that powered American nights came at the price of blood, toil, and entire whale populations. Substitutes existed, such as tallow candles from slaughtered cattle or camphene from pine, but they were pale imitations that produced smoke, foul odors, or posed serious fire risks. The real thing, the fuel that once marked the boundary between darkness and self-reliant light, was vanishing from the reach of ordinary people. Then, in 1859, a 40-year-old former railroad conductor named Edwin Drake brought it back by design in the hills of western Pennsylvania. He was spending his time in Titusville at the request of a group of investors from the Seneca Oil Company. His professor-like experts had challenged him to find a way to extract petroleum that bubbled up in small quantities from the ground. Most experts considered it worthless except as a patent medicine. Drake tried drilling using a technique adapted from salt wells. The experiment faced repeated failures, with the derrick collapsing and local residents calling it Drake's folly. But when Drake and his small team persisted through the summer, something extraordinary happened. On August 27, 1859, at a depth of just 69.5 feet, the drill struck oil. Black liquid rose in the well and began to flow. He had tapped into a reservoir of petroleum that would soon transform lighting forever. Drake had created the world's first commercial oil well. Against the furious objections of skeptics who saw the move as selling out to a worthless substance, Drake proved the resource was abundant underground. With financial backing from his investors, the well produced 25 barrels a day initially. News of the strike spread rapidly across the country. Within months, the fuel that had required entire whaling fleets for centuries cost virtually nothing to produce at scale. Pennsylvania crude oil was everywhere, a resource that landowners were desperate to tap. Kerosene, distilled from this petroleum, was now cheaper than whale oil by a wide margin. The kerosene lamp swept through American homes. Ordinary people could finally afford the steady, bright light that had been limited to the wealthy for centuries. The American whaling fleet reached its peak with more than 700 vessels in 1858, harvesting tens of thousands of whales annually to meet the demand. The discovery marked the beginning of a new era in American energy. Families no longer had to depend on the unpredictable supply from distant oceans. The light was brighter, cleaner, and more reliable than anything the whaling industry could offer. Yet in that moment of triumph, the seeds of a different kind of dependence were planted, though few could see it then. The price collapse was immediate and total. By 1860, kerosene sold for less than half the cost of whale oil. Whaling ships that once returned with fortunes now sat idle in New Bedford harbors. The American whaling fleet, which peaked at more than 700 vessels in 1858, shrank by nearly 90% within a decade, not gradually, abruptly. The industry that had powered American nights for 3 centuries vanished almost overnight. Substitutes that once filled the gap, such as tallow candles or camphene, disappeared from store shelves. Kerosene became the only practical choice. Families no longer had to depend on the unpredictable supply from distant oceans. The light was brighter, cleaner, and more reliable than anything the whaling industry could offer. Yet the freedom to choose your own source of energy had quietly slipped away. And here is where the economics become something else entirely. Cheap fuel was not simply abundant, it was becoming controlled. In 1870, a young bookkeeper named John D. Rockefeller founded Standard Oil in Cleveland, Ohio. He saw the chaos of thousands of small drillers and refiners and decided to impose order. Rockefeller bought up rival refineries one by one, using secret railroad rebates that gave his company unbeatable shipping rates. By 1882, Standard Oil controlled 90% of all American refining capacity. The company dictated prices, crushed competitors through predatory pricing, and lobbied legislatures to pass favorable laws. Independent drillers who once sold their own crude now found themselves forced to sell to Standard at whatever price Rockefeller offered. The man who had promised cheaper light to the masses had built the most powerful monopoly in American history. Alternatives existed. Farmers could distill ethanol from surplus corn or potatoes. Small inventors developed vegetable oil lamps and gas from coal that burned cleanly. These options were cheaper in some regions and required no distant pipelines or corporate middlemen. They were pale imitations only in the eyes of the new oil barons. Rockefeller and his allies systematically sidelined them. They funded scientific reports claiming ethanol was dangerous and inefficient. They lobbied Congress to impose heavy taxes on alcohol-based fuels while keeping kerosene tax-free. Patent medicines and lighting standards were rewritten to favor petroleum derivatives. Within 20 years, the decentralized energy choices that had defined American households for generations were gone. Zero. The pattern repeated on a global scale. Between 1900 and 1950, the political map of the world was completely redrawn. 4 major empires collapsed. The Ottoman, Austro-Hungarian, Russian, and German empires all disintegrated. Dozens of new nations emerged from the wreckage. Each one designed its energy system from scratch. Colonial territories across Asia and Africa gained independence throughout the 20th century. Each one chose new sources for new nations. They had every fuel available, including ethanol, biodiesel from local crops, and coal gas systems that could be produced locally. Not one chose full decentralization. Not the new republics of Eastern Europe. Not the newly independent states of the Middle East. Not the post-colonial nations of Africa or South Asia. They all built infrastructure around imported oil. They signed contracts with the same handful of multinational companies. The inertia argument collapses when you realize these were not old systems being preserved out of tradition. These were brand new energy grids designed by brand new governments for brand new countries. And every single one of them skipped the path of household-level independence. A parallel story played out in the United States itself. The original promise of oil was energy freedom for every farmer and mechanic. During the 1920s and 1930s, independent wildcatters still tried to compete. They drilled on their own land and sold directly to local markets. Rockefeller's successors responded with federal regulations, import quotas, and price controls that protected the majors. By 1950, the 7 largest oil companies controlled more than 80% of global production outside the Soviet bloc. Small producers were squeezed out through legal and financial pressure. The color of freedom, once available to anyone with a still or a windmill, was permanently erased from the energy map. The color of centralized power was permanently restored. Today, the same pattern holds. Nations that once lit their homes with locally rendered fats or fermented crops now import petroleum in vast tankers. The fuel that once symbolized liberation from whale oil tyranny has become the very symbol of dependence. Governments debate pipelines and reserves while households have no practical alternative. The price of energy is no longer set by the number of whales in the ocean. It is set by decisions made in corporate boardrooms and foreign capitals. And here is the detail that haunts the pattern. When countries gained independence after colonial rule, they did not restore decentralized fuel options. They doubled down on the imported system they inherited. The fuel of the people was permanently sidelined. The fuel of the monopoly was permanently entrenched. The pattern was clear, but the scale of it made me hesitate, because what I was seeing was not a conspiracy, it was something stranger. Nearly 200 independent nations spread across every continent, every culture, every political ideology, every era of modern history, all independently making the same choice: skip decentralized freedom. The most coordinated agreement in the history of energy policy, and nobody signed a treaty, nobody passed a resolution, nobody even discussed it. They all just knew. Oil was not merely a convenient fuel, it was the most controlled substance on Earth after 1859. For 3 centuries before Drake, displaying true energy independence without reliance on distant fleets or merchants had been the norm. No other source of light had required its own fleets, its own laws of the sea, its own sacrifice of lives and species. And the story of how that independence was lost explains exactly why. The new fuel came from underground reservoirs guarded more jealously than any whale pod. The ancient promise of household self-reliance became the production center of corporate empires, and the process was extraordinary in its subtlety. Workers no longer cracked open whales on open decks. They drilled into the earth and piped the black gold to distant refineries. Each well yielded rivers of crude, but only after the land was leased, the rights signed away, the flow directed by a handful of men in boardrooms. This secretion was refined in massive plants, heated under pressure, and distilled into kerosene that lit the world. The resulting fuel required entire railroads, entire tanker fleets, entire foreign policies to keep flowing. 1 barrel. That is the volume that could once have been replaced by a farmer's still or a local coal gas plant. The petroleum geologists and contemporary economists documented the shift in corporate charters and congressional hearings. Their accounts describe prices that had to remain carefully controlled. Too much local competition turned the market chaotic. The margin for error was almost non-existent. Because of this new production model, energy became literally valued at its weight in geopolitical power. Standard Oil's dominance by the 1880s confirms this. And here is where the economics becomes something else entirely. Cheap fuel was not simply abundant, it was legally and structurally forbidden to remain decentralized. The old promise of energy independence was declared obsolete. Governments and corporations together decreed that only large-scale petroleum answered to the new order. Anyone else caught producing ethanol at scale or maintaining independent windmills faced taxes, regulations, and market exclusion. The pattern across the 20th century is unmistakable. The sources of old independence were systematically removed from national energy policies and replaced with fuels that signaled centralized reinvention. When new nations emerged from the wreckage of empires, they chose pipelines and refineries. They picked fuels that told stories about their aspirations for modernity. None of them picked the source that for 3 centuries had meant your household answered only to itself. But oil, the newest and most potent symbol of imperial-scale authority, was never removed from these new systems. It was preemptively required. Even after cost ceased to be a barrier, the symbolic weight remained too heavy. Think about what oil represented after 1859. Not convenience, not progress. Those are the softened modern associations. Oil meant centralized authority. It meant governments and corporations chose your light for you. It meant the boundary between sovereign household and distant supplier was as fixed as the pipeline itself. When a nation locked itself into imported petroleum, it was not making an engineering statement. It was making a political claim. And when governments design their energy grids, they are making declarations about what kind of power they represent. Coal for industry, hydro for the state, nuclear for the future. These are sources that describe a relationship between a government and its people. Decentralized fuel does not describe a relationship. Decentralized fuel declares independence. Decentralized fuel says there is no negotiation between ruler and ruled when it comes to light and heat. There is only the local order. No republic wants that on its energy map. No democracy can afford that symbol. And no nation, even the ones that are functionally authoritarian, wants to advertise vulnerability to local failure so plainly. The cost explanation is a convenient history that expired in 1859. It persists because it is simple and satisfying. Whales were expensive, problem solved. But the real answer is not about economics. It is about what happens when a symbol is so powerful, so deeply encoded with 3 centuries of meaning, that even cheap access cannot strip it of its charge. Oil is the fuel that told billions of human beings, across dozens of civilizations, that their place in the world was fixed, that energy flowed downward from corporate wells and foreign fields through pipelines marked in black. When that system was locked in, when republics and democracies replaced self-reliant homes, the new governments did not just change their laws, they changed their fuels. They had to, because fuels carry memory that outlasts the empires that created them. You walk past gas stations and power lines every day. You've absorbed their infrastructure language without ever being taught it. Dependence means something to you. Self-reliance means something. You respond to those concepts at a level beneath conscious thought because 3 centuries of symbolic encoding does not wash out in a few generations. And somewhere in that subconscious vocabulary, oil still means what it always meant. Not progress, not freedom, not the modern marketing associations. Authority without consent, power without appeal. The fuel that separated the centralized from the local. So when nearly 200 countries all skip the same path, you have to ask questions. When the one nation that discovered it had true independence stripped within decades, you have to ask harder ones. Was it really about whales and technological progress? Or was it about a symbol so embedded in human consciousness that no modern nation dares claim it? What other freedoms have been quietly retired, not because they were outdated, but because they were too honest? And what does it mean that in 160 years of cheap petroleum, not one new nation has claimed decentralized energy independence? Not one has been willing to put it on the infrastructure that tells the world who they are. I sat with this research for 2 weeks before writing a word. The pattern was clear, but the scale of it made me hesitate. Every missing source of freedom is a confession.